my name is Rachel Stevenson, and I'm the Events and Social Manager here at Identity Automation, and I'll be your moderator today. Firstly, I want to let everyone know that all attendees' lines have been muted in order to make today's experience the best it can be for everyone on with us. With that being said, should you have any questions throughout the presentation, we encourage you to submit them using the comment and question submission box in the control panel on your screen, and we'll be sure to get everything answered either during our presentation or during the Q&A session. Today, our presenters are Principal Solution Consultant Greg Pearson and Identity Automation's founder and Identity Fellow, Troy Moreland. Today is part 2 of our webinar series, Advancing Your Identity Management Strategy with the IAM Maturity Model. Last month, we focused on the Federation Maturity Model, and today we're diving into the Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA, Maturity Model. So now it's time for the webinar. I'm going to be passing the mic and controls over to Greg for him to go into a brief overview of he and Troy's time at Identity Automation and a further explanation of the maturity model itself. Take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Pearson, and I will be one of the presenters today. I have been with Identity Automation for 10 years, focusing on identity and access management, and spent the balance of my career in various roles in technology, including leadership, strategy, and consulting. I am joined today by Troy Moreland, our founder and Identity Fellow here at Identity Automation. Troy is an industry expert in the area of identity and access management, having deployed various solutions in hundreds of organizations. All right. So let's get things started. I'd like to spend just a moment reviewing what a maturity model is and how it can be applied to IAM. A maturity model is a tool used to determine the effectiveness of current capabilities in a particular area of focus and can help provide a decision path and prioritization for increasing that capability through maturity. Applying a maturity model to IAM is looking at various tenants within the IAM space, evaluating the current level for each, and determining steps to increase capability to move to the next level. As a reminder, this webinar series focuses on each of the core tenant areas of IAM and explores various levels of maturity and capability in each tenant. The underlying concept is to provide a framework that can be covered in smaller, digestible segments and can be used as a tool to help organizations evaluate where they are at in their overall IAM strategy, as well as what areas to focus on in order to increase their level of maturity. I also want to make a point to say it's important that organizations may or may not have products in the various tenets of IAM in place already and may be at various levels of maturity. Also important to note, there's not a rule that says that an organization has to implement each of these tenets in any particular order. That being said, let's jump into our topic for this segment. In this part of our series, we will focus on the maturity levels of multi-factor authentication. In our last webinar, we focused on federation, and Troy had mentioned adding MFA as a part of the maturity between the integrated and mesh levels. Today, Troy will expand on multi-factor authentication as a whole and how it can be applied to an IAM solution as a whole. Moving through our maturity series, MFA fits nicely as the next topic because it is another tenet that many of our attendees may have currently implemented or are in the process of implementing. Additionally, MFA is a tenet of IAM that is somewhat less complex to implement as compared to some of the future tenets that we will be covering. Troy is now going to take us through the maturity of multi-factor authentication, starting with the basic level and moving all the way through an intelligent level. With that, Troy, I'll turn it over to you.
Greg kind of already covered this, but I just want to talk about why I think these maturity models are important. Really, that's to provide you with 3 things. The first one is give you a way to measure where you are in the identity management maturity model. And then secondly, once we kind of go through what these are in detail, go through the different levels, let you determine what your desired state is, because you may not want to be level 4 of everything. So being able to see where you are and where you want to go is obviously important. And number 2, in line with that, is having that is going to give you some tangible data to help you go forward in building out a plan and a strategy, and also to help procure budget, because you're showing tangible benefits of where you would like to be and what that includes. And then thirdly, Once you get that budget, then you start looking at vendors. So you can also use this maturity model to help as a way to measure those vendors in the different areas that are important to you. At a minimum, those are the three things I hope you get out of these maturity model discussions.
Hey, Troy, before you get too deep into this, on this particular slide, looking at the level 1 through level 4, for example, as our attendees are going through this and listening to the content you're presenting, if they find themselves between maybe a level 1 and level 2 or a level 2 and a level 3, and they're trying to measure themselves, what's your advice for determining what level they're actually at?
I would tend to round down, if you will. So meaning once we go through the details of what are in these levels, first of all, you're not going to want to implement everything that's detailed in all of these. So when you specify or determine which of the items in these levels that you want to implement and say, you're level 1 right now because you have met all the criteria. For level 2, there's maybe 3 criteria and you have 2 of those. So I would say that you're at a level 1 until you have implemented everything level 2 has to offer for your organization. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you, Troy.
So with all the maturity models we're going to go through, there's basically going to be two slides for each maturity model. One is the overview, which is what we're looking at here, and then there will be a more detailed view of each of these as well. So what you can see is there's 4 levels defined for every maturity model. Keep in mind, though, that there is a level 0, and in the case of multi-factor authentication, being at level 0 just means your users are simply using or strictly using username and password to log into different systems and applications. There's no other factor of authentication being utilized. But otherwise, the 4 levels, we have basic, which is the implementation of 2-factor authentication. We have advanced, where you're now being able to take advantage of MFA, multi-factor, so more than 2 factors, through the use of authentication policies that you can define. And then the level 3, you add adaptive or contextual criteria to those authentication policies. And level 4 is going full board with artificial intelligence to use its capabilities to enhance your MFA. So that's the brief overview. Before we go on, I always like to level set on terminology as much as possible. So what MFA means, at least to identity automation, is authentication methods. So multi-factor authentication, the factors are what you're using to authenticate. So in any authentication, there's 2 parts. There's identifying yourself, and then there's verifying that you are who you say you are. So in level 0, you're using a username to identify yourself, and you're using a password to verify that. And then with MFA, you've got 3 types of authentication methods. At least that's how you categorize them. One is knowledge. So what you know, a password is a knowledge factor. There's a possession type, which would be something that you physically have, a FIDO, USB token, hard token, like an RSA ID. And then you have inherent. And inherent would be anything about you, who you are. So all of your biometric authentication methods would be in the inherent category. And beyond just the methods themselves, MFA should also be inclusive of authentication policies. And we'll go deeper into that in this talk. So I think that's good for the overview. We want to go to the next slide unless there's any questions.
None at this time, Troy.
All right. So again, level 0, which is not on the board, is if you have not implemented any other mechanisms for authentication for your end users besides your username and password. But whereas level 1, we're using basic 2-factor authentication. So the most common 2-factor that we see both at work as well as in the different consumer sites that a lot of us use, the most common would be username and password as the first factor, and then a one-time password for your second factor. And the one-time password is typically a 6-digit number that changes every minute, and you might have a piece of hardware that gives you that number, or it can be what's called a soft token, so using an app on your phone or your desktop to generate that. And by the way, if you are using consumer services, I'm talking about anything, Facebook, Pinterest, all of them have two-factor authentication support. It's really a good idea to implement those. Of course, banking and anything like that, absolutely. But even within your business, that's the basic for two-factor authentication. At a minimum, that should be at least two types of authentication methods, two categories. So one knowledge and one possession, for example, one knowledge and one inherent. But again, most commonly it would be knowledge like password and possession like a one-time password. One thing of note is a lot of people don't realize that push notification for authentication to a mobile device in one method actually covers multiple types. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, so let me clarify. If you identify yourself in the application and then it sends you a push notification, for one, you have to have that phone, so it's a possession. Number two, you have to be able to unlock that phone. So it would be knowledge base if it's a PIN, or it would even be inherent if it's something like Touch ID, and then you approve that. So what I'm getting at is in that one method, you're actually knocking out two-factor authentication. Not to mention it's very usable and friendly for your end users. So once you get to that point, what are the next steps for getting to level 2? So the big thing here is to start building your risk profile. And in this case, what I'm referring to is defining all the different user types in your organization that may have a different risk profile or different risk score. So the highest level of risk would be things like your network administrators, could also be people in the business that have access to personal information, PII, PCI, all those types of data elements, all the way down to people, you may have someone who only has an account because they have to enter their time that they've worked. So that would be low risk. Identifying those and kind of giving them a risk score as best you can is really going to set you up in order to implement these later levels. Any questions on level 1?
Yes, Troy, just thinking through what you just mentioned, thinking through the risk profiles there. So when you're talking about risk profiles, that you may have a small number of risk profiles, you may have a large number of risk profiles depending on your organization. Could that even include people that are not employees of your organization?
Yeah, it's any type of user who's accessing your systems and is doing any sort of authentication to do so. So someone hitting your public website, that's not included in these risk profiles. But if you have a customer who logs in, if you've got contractors, partners, vendors, internal staff, contractors, students, what have you, those are all possible different user types that you need to examine in order to assign them with some sort of risk scoring.
Great, thank you.
And so level 2 is when we really get to the pure MFA, meaning that you can support multiple factors of authentication, not just two. And that starts with the support for authentication policies that are rather granular, meaning you can have multiple authentication policies that can be associated with users. And they would be associated with users based on different criteria, but all identity-based criteria, like what attributes do I have, what roles am I in, what entitlements do I have, things of that nature. And then associating the different authentication methods with those policies. Could be one method, could be 10 methods, whatever is appropriate, which gets back to your risk profiling. To be a full MFA authentication policy or a full strength authentication policy with MFA, at a minimum, you're supposed to have one of each category of authentication method. So one knowledge, one possession, one inherent. So those would be your highest risk factor user groups that would, be expected to have each of those. Again, that's just based on the risk factor. Doesn't mean everyone in the organization has to have all of those. If you've got enough flexibility, you could, maybe alter that a bit to say 1 knowledge and 2 possession, things of that nature. Really, it boils down to those risk profiles and what you need to do to secure yourself. I mean, I'm sure most of you know that the breaches that we hear about in the news are easily avoided by having multi-factor authentication enabled, because usually it's someone capturing another user's username and password. Next steps in getting to level 3 for planning purposes, making sure that your highest risk users are protected with the highest level of risk mitigating authentication policies. So you've defined the policies, you're starting to associate them. Now start thinking about things that are more contextual and how that could alter your authentication policies and implementation. And that would give us to level 3. Any questions on level 2?
Yeah, just before you go on to level 3, Troy, looking at this and what you had just talked about in the advanced level, so looking at support for advanced authentication methods, you have a few mentioned there. So part of that maturity journey for our attendees would also be thinking about, you may have some investment in some other types of technologies as well as you start to move this out. It's not just applying that to your MFA solution, but also looking at how you might have some extraneous costs involved with deploying that as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations are able to implement really strong authentication methods without necessarily spending a lot of money on hardware. I mean, we've had building access cards, whether they are magnetic stripe or proximity. Those have been around, forever. Being able to take advantage of those same pieces of hardware to use for authentication is obviously a significant savings, and not having to give someone else yet another piece of hardware to maintain. I remember when I was first learning about multi-factor authentication and learning about smart cards, thinking, how expensive is it to have to provision smart cards for everybody in your organization? And at the time, the person that was demonstrating it to me said, do you have a credit card with a chip in it? And I was, yeah, I do. And they were able to register that credit card as me. And from now on, I was able to use my credit card as a authentication method. So things like that, a lot of things you can do today that will help you get to very strong authentication without having to spend a lot of money. So
that's great advice. Thanks, Troy.
So level 3, adaptive policies, also referred to as contextual criteria. So as I said, in level 2, we have authentication policies, and they're associated with users based on their identity, which it could be static, could be dynamic. Dynamic meaning I'm going to look at your attributes. Today you're in HR, so you get this policy. Tomorrow you're in IT, so you get this policy. But there are other situations that, besides my identity data, that might matter, and that's where the adaptive and contextual come in. So the most common scenario or the most common criteria would be where you're coming from. What's your device source location? So are you in the office? Are you at home? Or are you coming from China? So those would be contextual, and as a result, you could have different authentication policies apply, even though, I'm still Troy, nothing changed about me except for where I'm coming from. And obviously the reason for this is, as things are more available to the public internet, we have to just do more to verify, not trying to make Troy's life harder on the road, just trying to make sure that it is Troy who's trying to get, their job done. Other factors in the adaptive criteria could be the day of the week or the time of day. If you're an organization that pretty much is 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, then anything outside of that is probably considered risk or higher risk, and therefore you can apply different authentication policies. And then this could be extended to being even more custom. For example, we had a customer that said they have employees that are hourly, and they'll do their 40 hours during the week. And on the weekends, they were logging in and doing training, and they were legally obligated to pay them overtime. So, we help them think about that, and how many hours you've worked could actually be an authentication method. Or perhaps you want to do it based on mandatory security training. In addition to that, looking at applications themselves. So what we're talking about so far is session authentication. So how do I get logged into my session, and then I start accessing things with single sign-on, which is our next maturity model. But also at level 3 is looking at the applications themselves, so that you can say things like, even though I already have authenticated for my session, I always want to force authentication anytime I access this particular application, or I want to require certain methods, and if you didn't use a certain method when you initiate your session, you are going to have to do it in order to access this application. Also embedding multi-factor authentication into the applications that have that modularity tied in, so you can enforce multi-factor in the native application itself. And then lastly, adding more modern types of authentication methods. What came to mind when I was doing this was voice and face recognition, which, by the way, can be used to verify, but it's a great way to do the identify aspect. So walk up to my computer, sees my face, and then it sends me a push notification to my phone for the verification. Very user-friendly and extremely secure. And then next, to prepare for level 4, it's really about your strategy for artificial intelligence in general. So I'll leave it at that and move on to level 4 unless there's questions.
Okay, we can go ahead and go on to level 4.
Okay. Artificial intelligence, you're going to have a strategy or you're not. You're going to outsource it or do it in-house. So let me just explain where artificial intelligence fits within the discussion of multi-factor authentication. And I would put it into one of 2 categories. One is using AI-driven authentication methods. Really, voice recognition and facial recognition are AI, but also things like keystroke patterns, learning over time, how you interact with the keyboard is a great example. The second category would be anomaly detection. So instead of having hard-coded criteria based on identity, based on context, also having behavioral analytics looking at, 3 o'clock in the morning really isn't that odd for Troy because he works ungodly hours. So I'm not going to keep challenging him every time he comes in at Saturday at 3 a.m. So those are really the AI factors that come into play here. Expanding your library of authentication methods. So, we have kindergartners who are logging into Rapid Identity, all the way up to system administrators. So making sure you have authentication methods that provide the flexibility that you need for your different end user groups, as well as providing the security that you need is extremely, extremely important. Was there any questions around level 4?
Not at this time. That was a great overview. Thanks, Troy. Appreciate you going through those 4 levels. So we've got one more slide, and then we're gonna wrap up the content and go into the questions. So from this particular slide that's up here, this is just an example of a maturity model scorecard that we put together. And as we go through our webinar series and look at the various maturity levels for each of the tenants, think about how you would score your organization, and as you put those scores together, you can develop something that the graphic that's on the right-hand side is called a radar graph, showing that score that you have overall for your total IAM maturity. So you can put something together simple like this and come up with your model to see what areas that you need to focus on for your organization as you go forward. So again, just an example, but we like to show it so that you'll have some idea of how to score yourself as an organization for your maturity within the identity and access management levels. With that, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We're now going to start with our Q&A session. And to remind those who weren't on when I explained earlier, we might run over our 30-minute time block with this. If you can't stay on the line with us, don't worry. We'll be sending out all the questions from today with their answers alongside the recording of the presentation itself. So, Greg, you can take it away with the questions.
Okay, we've just got a couple of questions. So, Troy, looking to you to field some of the advice on these questions. So, we got a question about, you had mentioned fine-grained policies. Could you give an example of a fine-grained policy?
Yep. So typically fine-grained means you can look at any attributes that you have available to you, for your users. So for employees, you've got things like their department, their job or position, their location. And then you can look at things like what entitlements they already have. So if they're a domain administrator and that's represented as an entitlement, then that's another, example, or what roles they're in. If you have a nurse versus a doctor, and then being able to handle exceptions. So it's a doctor, but it's a doctor at this location who's just doing instructional training. So they wouldn't have to necessarily abide by the stronger methods. So that's the fine grain for criteria. Is that answering that question?
Yeah, that sounds great. That's a great answer. So another question that came in is, could you give an example of step-up authentication? You also had mentioned that.
Yeah, that can take, in my opinion, I express it in two different ways. One is you're always needing to authenticate before accessing an application, a specific application. Another way to look at it is an application is requiring a certain level of authentication method, but when you initiated your session initially, you didn't necessarily use a method that falls into that stronger category. So step up could just mean that at the time I launched the app, it knows what methods I've used and it does not meet the criteria. So then it would require me to use a stronger method. Whereas if I had already used a stronger method to initiate my session to begin with, I may not be challenged in that way.
Great, thanks. So last question that we have for the day is, can MFA be applied to data privacy?
In terms of, MFA is not access control to data specifically. It's access control at the door. So I think I would answer that in terms of, if, again, you're doing your risk profiling, if you have users who have access to sensitive data, then their risk profile is going to be greater than those who don't. And at a certain point, anyone that gets to a certain risk level, you need to be implementing strong authentication policies and methods for them. So, in that sense, as long as you're ensuring that everyone that has that type of risk profile is requiring multi-factor authentication, then in that sense, yes, you are, protecting data privacy.
Excellent. All right, that's all the questions we have.
All righty, well, with that, we're wrapping up the Q&As. So just a final reminder for everyone, we are going to be sending out a recording of today's webinar, as well as all the questions asked today with their answers. And also, if you did ask any case-specific questions, we will be answering directly to you to get you the best answer possible, as well as any follow-up questions that you may have. So once again, I want to thank Greg and Troy for their time preparing and giving today's presentation, everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to log on and join us, and a big thank you to those who will be downloading and listening after the fact. We look forward to continuing this series next month on July 24th with part 3, covering the single sign-on maturity model. If you haven't already signed up, we will be sending out your registration reminder information, and for those of you who haven't signed up, be sure to keep your eyes peeled for an email with the details. Thanks again, and we hope everyone has a great day.